Shalom everyone, welcome to our four-part series on the Holocaust. In the first two sessions, we took a look at the socio-economic and political stage that facilitated the rise of Nazism and also the religious climate, how both the Protestant and Catholic churches responded. And then we linked these things to the origins of anti-Semitism. And we also briefly examined the rise of Zionism and its interplay with the Holocaust and referred to its prophetic importance from Scripture. Then in our third session, we explored the alarming phenomenon of Holocaust denial and distortion, where we examined the dangerous belief system which many people buy into, including and for me personally, this is what is perhaps most alarming, those who claim to be born again evangelical Christians. Well, today in our fourth and final session on the Holocaust, we are going to consider the effect upon the first and second generations of children who grew up surrounded by parents and wider family who were Holocaust victims. But before we start, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and don't forget to leave a comment in the section underneath. Let me begin with a story, which I believe will help us better understand the common plight of Holocaust survivors and how it has impacted their progeny. There's a story that contends with the emotion of guilt. At some point in my early adolescence, my mother decided that she needed to take me to the synagogue. This was my first exposure to the Bernie Rosenfeld experience. It was awful, so awful, Rabbi Kleinberg finally had to surrender his pulpit and to sit in the pews holding his head as Bernie verbally attacked him and the entire congregation. Later, I left my hometown only to return 20 years later. But things had not changed at the synagogue. Bernie still attended and continued to pour his tirade over the congregation. One of his favorite targets was an old man, Eli Green, who was a quiet, humble man in stature. I remember watching Mr. Green just sitting there, quietly taking in every insult. When Bernie was finally gone, Mr. Green told us, "This is our kapora, our atonement." And sometime before World War II, he explained, a lad of 14 years came to our city from Germany with a Torah scroll. And he had witnessed his older brother beaten to death by Hitler youth on his home doorstep. He had witnessed other horrors as well, but it was hard to make sense of his descriptions of them. He came to our community and he screamed and he yelled, "Jews, do something! Save your brothers and sisters!" The people thanked him for the Sefer Torah, and they asked him to stop screaming about things they could do nothing about. He claimed that they just didn't believe him. He claimed they just didn't care. I know that there were European Jews saved by the community. And comparing these efforts to the magnitude of horror and distress he carried with him from the other side of the world, Bernie saw only apathy, and he never forgave them. "We didn't listen to Bernie before the war," said Mr. Green. "So we've listened to him for the past 70 years. In the 1960s and 1970s, many children of Holocaust survivors began exploring the repercussions of the traumas their parents had experienced and had somehow survived, and how this had impacted their lives as a next generation post-Holocaust. Until then, since the end of World War II in 1945, The subject was largely taboo, filled with a terrifying vacuum which desperately sought an audience, but with few willing to or able emotionally to speak out. Psychological studies were conducted among several of these second-generation anomalies to determine how profound and in what manner their parents' nightmarish experiences had affected their lives. Second-generation awareness groups then began to be established where people explored their experiences in a safe place of mutual understanding and support. Holocaust survivors battled with what would be the best for their children, what they considered to be the best for their children. And should they live in a Jewish or a Gentile neighborhood? Should they become integrated within society, or just to hide away in anonymity? To bear offspring, or to replace all those who had perished, or choose never to have any children ever again who might become future victims of another Holocaust. They felt besieged by these kind of questions emerging from a common fear that the next generation might also face the horrors of genocide. People who survived the Holocaust bore open wounds of unresolved conflicts in the aftermath of their experiences, which really faced them as spectres and invaded their lives. They who, particularly those who were closest to them and most vulnerable, their children. Among them were a small number of Messianic Jewish believers who received a measure of healing and restoration. Those who fought with God, like the patriarch Jacob, who yet fought with God but prevailed, though at a terrible cost, very often with wounds that would always remain with them. The remnant of Messianic believers who are children of Holocaust survivors constitute actually a very wide diversity of people, from secular backgrounds with strong ties to Israel and Zionism, those from a traditional Jewish background merged with other cultures and traditions, mainly liberal or reform identifications. And of course, a religious segment from Jewish backgrounds, conservative or Orthodox Jewish people. And then from the other, perhaps spectrum, assimilated Jews with links to no interest whatsoever in their Jewish roots. Messianic believers are faced with this spectre to make sense of the Holocaust from a spiritual perspective. Questions such as, how could God have allowed these things to happen? Or how does a Holocaust relate to a biblical understanding of the events which took place? Or what does the Bible teach us about forgiving our enemies? From a broader perspective, many Holocaust survivors who had themselves been children during the war, with significant numbers becoming orphans, have been fostered out. Many of them have been fostered out in foreign lands with an alien language, with an unfamiliar culture that could sometimes be cruel and lacking in sympathy, usually due to ignorance. Many children, such as those from Kindertransport, child transports, lacked positive parental role models as a support once they had their own children. Some Holocaust survivors recall how their parents used a fight or flight method of problem solving during the war that was transferred by default to their own children and succeeding generations thereafter. And it is this category, the children of Holocaust survivors, which will be our focus in this session, whose lives were less obviously impacted and yet were nonetheless directly affected through reliving the traumas of their parents. Parents who'd been traumatized by the Holocaust subconsciously transferred much of their emotional baggage upon their children. Something very messy, very complex, because instead of remaining spectators, the children found themselves trapped within their parents' nightmare. For example, my own mother became an orphan with no surviving relatives except a distant uncle, and she was tormented with the guilt of survival. Just to give you a picture, out of a total population of 1.6 million from European descent, over 1 million Jewish children, that's 2/3, perished in the Holocaust. And only a remnant survived to bear families. Their offspring were often raised within a very highly dysfunctional family environment, where as casualties of the Holocaust, many of their traumas were transferred to their children unconsciously rather than as it intended. And this facilitated a worldview tainted with layers of woundedness that other Jewish families who had enjoyed living in safety for generations had been spared. My paternal grandfather attempted to reach freedom from Nazi Austria and headed for Palestine. And after miraculously reaching the shores of Haifa, he was then subsequently arrested by the British and deported to a POW camp in Mauritius, where he, alongside over 1,570 others, were treated as criminals. And he died 2 years later, directly due to the harsh treatment of prison life, alongside inadequate medical care. My grandmother, who had miraculously escaped to the UK with my father, died shortly afterwards from a broken heart, leaving my father a refugee in a foreign land. And consequently, my sister and I grew up without grandparents and parents who struggled to come to terms with life in post-Holocaust UK. If God has a destiny, a perfect plan for our lives, which I believe he does, how does it relate to those who are casualties of the Holocaust? What constructive purpose was served in the trauma and the magnitude of loss which 6 million families suffered? Jewish people consistently ask these kind of questions and are supplied with varieties of explanations. But all of these at best can only provide a conspicuously incomplete picture. Some claim that it was the judgment of God upon an apostate people. Others provide economic explanations. They'd say, well, during the time leading up to the rise of Hitler, the nation of Germany, and of course this is factually true, was bankrupt from World War I. Hitler began promoting his strong anti-Semitic views and scapegoated the Jewish people for what he considered were responsible for the nation's economic woes. And other things, from a purely secular lens, then this whole interpretation of the Holocaust is a prime example, they would say, of the evil of humanity that is capable of perpetrating beyond which they would say everything else is meaningless. I think this is a sad perspective to hold, but nonetheless there are many who do so. And looking at the Bible, it states that God uses everything, including evil, for his sovereign purposes. Otherwise how can he be God? And we may only gain a small glimpse how he used the Holocaust for good, but it cannot be denied that out of the ashes of the Holocaust was birthed the re-establishment of Israel as a sovereign state, a miracle of epic proportions following over 1900 years of exile. For Holocaust victims, to forget is impossible. To even attempt to do so is like peering over the precipice into an inferno. The spectre is always there to haunt them. Well, some sought closure by breaking the silence, but most or many others just did the very opposite, to suppress our emotions for fear of reliving this nightmare, a very common experience of those who have suffered severe trauma, of various types. Children of Holocaust victims grew up in two worlds, one with family and the other independent from them. For example, at home, they were surrounded with the relics of an alien culture, immersed within the closeted, ghetto-like environment. And yet, parallel to this, they experienced an entirely different life externally in society that enjoyed the freedom of expanded boundaries, acceptance, and a fair degree of normality. How did then the next generation post-Holocaust cope with growing up in a world without grandparents, in the main, or close relatives, many times being thrust into an overbearing and dysfunctional family who loved them passionately, but expressed it chaotically? The simplest response for many was simply just to accommodate unreality with denial. But the past has a way of catching up with us, marring one's identity with deep scars inherited from parents who had experienced the unthinkable and yet somehow had survived. Children of Holocaust survivors grew up under the guardianship of traumatized parents. Many have been doomed to relive the effects of it upon their lives. And in that way, Hitler triumphed in a manner even he could not have conceived. One child, a parent who were Holocaust survivors, an author, Fern Shulman Chapman, observed the following. Survivors were generally older than escapees and had slightly more control over their fates. They relied upon qualities within themselves that saved their lives. Torture, abuse, and loss taught survivors to be cunning, enduring, or even complicit, anything to live just another day. And yet escapees, Holocaust escapees, were children and therefore pure victims. And she continues, if my mother had been a Holocaust survivor, maybe she would be grateful and could have felt each day as a gift. Every year is a mission. And yet, as an escapee, she feels that she just doesn't deserve to live. And for that matter, she's not sure she wants to. Not without her parents. Her understanding is stuck in a 12-year-old's broken heart. All she can know is that her mother and her motherland abandoned and rejected her. And that's what she can never escape. And then here's a shocking example she used to illustrate her point. She said, when I was 10 years old and our family returned from an unusually delightful weekend of downhill skiing, I saw the limitations of my mother's happiness. When we got home, she locked herself in the bathroom and sobbed wildly from behind the door. What's wrong? My father asked her, is he not? Didn't we have a good weekend? She refused to open the door, but yelled from what seemed like the other side of a gulf. Yes, we had a wonderful time. I don't think I'll ever have a day like this again. I've never been so happy, and I doubt if I'll ever be again. But I just don't deserve it. The whole thinking had been submerged in a false narrative that she bought into. Because so many so-called better people than herself, or what she considered to be better people, had perished. She had no right to have survived, and yet let alone lead a happy and fulfilled life. These are the types and thoughts and common threads which Holocaust survivors are frequently tormented with and struggle to come to terms with, using various mechanisms such as overcompensation that then they will unconsciously dump upon their offspring. Children of Holocaust survivors generally lack the skills to respond effectively to the psychological traumas and dysfunctions variously expressed as they grew up and relived the effects of the Holocaust through their parents' eyes. Instead, it became woven into the very fibre and manifested as a, if you like, a second-generation anomaly. The overpowering feeling of overprotectiveness, often experienced from their parents, held a strongly invasive impact upon their lives. And consequently, many experienced difficulty leaving home when they became independent for fear of hurting their parents and it being interpreted or seen as a rejection. Children of Holocaust survivors had not yet developed the emotional maturity to understand what was happening in the lives of their parents, and so instead they just simply considered everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, as being normal. According to current statistics, there are over 200,000 children of Holocaust survivors globally, and each of them are faced to some degree with this dilemma. Here again is another example from a well-known author. My mother, who was just 12 when she and her family were rounded up from their home in Chernovitz, Romania, and sent to the ghetto. Her father was killed almost immediately and other relatives perished at some point or another. But she, her mother, aunt and young cousin were shipped to a work camp in the Ukraine before they escaped via the Jewish underground to another, supposedly better camp. She was 16 when liberation came, survived a bout of untreated typhoid fever that killed her mother, and lived in orphanages until she was reunited with family members who luckily had left Romania before Hitler arrived. And that's about all I know. She went on to marry, as many survivors did, to mixed results, especially if they married other survivors, and made a life in a world that often didn't want to know too much about their experiences, or that sometimes blamed the survivors themselves for their own fate. They were eager to have children. I mean, what better way to prove their aliveness despite their immense losses and suffering? Or if they had lost children in the camps or on the way to them, to start a new family. Some Holocaust survivors shared intimate details of their experiences with their children, sometimes with a layer of guilt when really there should be none. Like when their children misbehaved, as all kids do. I survived for this. Or express their own pain. You don't know what suffering is. Others, like my mother, were unable or unwilling to speak of the horrors they knew, thus creating a mystery that their children can't help but try to solve. With a child's curious mind and a budding writer's vivid imagination, I filled in the blanks of my mother's life, imagining all sorts of terrors that may or may not have been true, all of which made me become protective of her. That was not a healthy thing, as I later came to understand. Caretaking, denial, anxiety and self-sacrifice became my unconscious vocabulary when it came to those I loved. And really, what was I protecting from her? She survived. She was strong. Well, I'm not too interested in being a victim or pathologizing my past. Many of us grew up with less than perfect childhoods, just as many have experienced horrific situations such as poverty, abuse, trauma, and natural disasters and war, and yet have managed to live happy, healthy, fulfilling and productive lives. Others continue to struggle, some more than others, sometimes with devastating effects. Still, I do not really need second-generation studies to understand how the Shoah, the Holocaust, and the loss of everything my mother had, a home, her parents, her friends, a sense of normalcy, transformed a confident, healthy, well-adjusted and normal girl who was known in her family as a bit of a rascal into the woman I knew as my mother. While I spent my adolescence, like most teens, crafting my own sense of identity, she was just trying to survive. Hitler did not take her life, but he changed it in ways that linger in her children even today. End of quote. A frequent question asked by Holocaust survivors has been why they were allowed to live while so many others, whom they considered, often wrongly, better than themselves, why did they perish? And these types of questions may keep a person emotionally paralyzed, crippled, and embedded in an unending nightmare of guilt. Some people refuse to allow themselves to be tormented in this way and resign themselves to the fact that nobody possesses all the answers to life's dilemmas. And others, rather than diminishing the greatness of God, learn to enlarge it. Scripture puts this well in the book of Proverbs, where it urges us to, quote, trust in the Lord with all your heart, not in our own understanding. In all our ways, acknowledge him, and he will make straight our paths. Well, things are not always as they may appear. Take again the following story as an example. When we were in the concentration camp, we slept in bunks in the barracks. There weren't bunk beds like you may have, comfortable, with proper mattresses. Each bunk was about the size of a double bed, but 9 of us slept on that hard board. How did we fit? Well, we all had to lie sideways, stuffed together like sardines, or like spoons in a drawer. There was no room for a person to lie on his back or stomach. We all had to turn over at the same time. I slept at the end of the bunk. I think that was a good place to have because you only were squashed on one side. In the winter, it was actually the worst place to be. You see, we had no covers and certainly no heat, so the only thing that kept us warm was the body heat of our bunkmates. The person at the end of the bunk had no one on one side of him to keep him warm. Often, after a particularly freezing night, people would wake up in the morning and find that the last person on the bunk had just simply frozen to death during the night. On one very cold night, I was shivering so hard, and I felt that I was freezing to death. All of a sudden, I felt a little bit of warmth on my exposed side, and then another, and then another. I looked and I saw the rats from the barracks, who were also freezing, had crawled into the bunk and were lying next to me. They absorbed the heat from my body, and they in turn warmed me. Together, we survived. And so, he says in closing, you can't kill a rat because the rats saved my life. Scripture can help us understand things better, but sometimes it depends on the translator's interpretation. For example, let's take a verse from the book of Job. In the Revised Standard Version, it reads this: "Behold, he will slay me," referring to Job's words. "Behold, he will slay me. I have no hope." However, the Authorized Version provides a very different rendition. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." So the words of Job can bring hope or hopelessness depending on one's point of view. The Talmud tells us that the 613 laws can be summed up in just one: "The righteous shall live by his faith." That's a quote from Habakkuk in chapter 2 and verse 14. And the faith which Habakkuk here speaks of is a distinguishing factor in an age-old dilemma, one which has vexed many people. I personally believe that it is possible only through faith in Yeshua that any person, whether a Holocaust victim, a child of Holocaust victims, or anyone else for that matter, whether Jew or Gentile, to receive God's peace and healing that passes all understanding, even amid the worst of circumstances and traumas that the world can throw at us. And it is through the challenges and harsh realities of life that becomes a bridal indicator which separates those who truly love God as opposed to those who are merely hangers-on or fair weather friends. And so to end, here again are some thoughts for reflection, for our reflection in a private study. I do hope that through this brief 4-part series on the Holocaust, you have been provoked in your understanding and love for the Jewish people. That's my hope. That's my desire. So anyway, let's begin with some things just to ponder upon. Imagine that your next door neighbours were Holocaust victims with children of their own. How would you approach building a Holocaust with the parents or the children? And if you were to interview a Holocaust survivor, what would be the kind of questions that you might ask them? How are the lives of the children of Holocaust survivors moulded by their parents' experiences? And how do Holocaust survivors deal with guilt? In other words, questions such as, why did I survive but others not? And what advice would you offer to them? What is a place of forgiveness? This is a really fundamental, a vital question for those who become victims of Nazi tyranny. And by the way, this is an incredibly important issue for everyone, anyone, for humanity. What is the place of forgiveness for those who become victims of Nazi tyranny? And what is the best way for Holocaust victims to deal with anti-Semitism? Or how might a believer's view of the Holocaust differ from a non-believing Jew? Well, from me, Roger Lenk, may the Lord bless you richly. And I do look forward for you to join me in the next few weeks for a brand new series on topics of interest concerning Jewish identity from biblical to modern times, and their influence and their impact in changing the world as we know it today. Shalom and lehitraot.